Module 2, we covered the arrhythmias that we are going to be looking at for your test. And one thing to remember is that all of your arrhythmias, like the ones that you're doing on your paper and all, are in what lead?
2.
Lead 2. Why?
Because it gets a natural flow.
Yeah, the axis of the positive electrode is much closer as far as the angle goes. And so one of the good things about lead 2 is that it can give us at least a quick look if we've got a lethal arrhythmia or something else. Of course, we're always going to do a 12 lead after we notice something that's cardiac centered. So really quickly, let's just go over the components of the ECG, because as y'all have learned by now, each one of these represents something, and when we're going over our rules, there might be something in the components here that we're looking for. So your P wave, that's going to be SA node, right? That's going to be atria, SA node to atria to the AV node. So then you've got your PR segment here, which we measure our PRI from the start of the P wave to the Q wave. What does the PRI represent?
The atrial repolarization.
What's the AV node do?
It holds electrical signals.
Yeah. So the AV node is actually holding the conduction, just really briefly. Why?
Turn that way for the kick.
To allow for the atrial kick to occur, to allow for ventricular filling. Then we've got our QRS, which represents what?
Ventricular repolarization.
Ventricular depolarization. All right, my S comes down into the ST segment, which is the portion between the S wave and the T wave. What is this little point right here called? The J point. So when we go into ST elevation recognition, that's where we're going to be referencing. Okay? And then our T wave, it represents what?
Depolarization.
Ventricular repolarization. So last week I told you that the T wave is the most dynamic wave. What do I mean by that?
Like you can change the most.
Yeah, so it's the most affected or the easiest affected by electrolytes and other things. So we're going to get to all that here in a few minutes. Alright, so when I'm looking at my PRI, what am I measuring? What's the time?
0.12 to 0.20.
0.12 to 0.20. So anything greater than 0.20, if we've got a constant PRI, is going to be considered what?
First degree block.
First degree block. First degree AV block. What is an example of a arrhythmia or a complex that would have a shortened PRI? Wolff-Parkinson-White. Remember, we've got that aberrant pathway where the conduction bypasses the the AV node, so we don't have that momentary pause right there. Okay? So, what do we want our QRS to measure?
Less than 0.12.
Yeah, less than 0.12 or 120 milliseconds or less. So a normal conduction is going to be sharp and pointy. You're not going to have a lot of a Q wave, because if you start developing Q waves, that's something that's pathological, and we don't want that to occur. Right? So we said that this represents ventricular depolarization. So we got the conduction going through, and then it goes out around the Purkinje fibers, and it causes contraction. So the J point, that's, again, where we're going to be looking for ST elevation or depression. And then the T wave represents ventricular repolarization. So if I draw a line from the start of the P wave to about the apex or the middle of the T wave, what is this period called?
Refractory.
What?
Refractory.
Refractory, which one?
Absolute.
So that would be our absolute. I'm just quizzing you to see if you learned anything. Module 1. And so from here to this little part here is what? The relative. Alright. The QT interval, so it's not something that we measure in our basic EKG monitoring stuff, but as you get more experienced, you want to start looking at the QT interval because there's several things that can affect the QT interval. Electrolytes, what's one of the main electrolytes that affects the QT interval?
Potassium.
Not potassium.
Calcium.
Calcium. If a person is hypocalcemic, what's the QT interval going to look like?
Less.
It's going to be longer, right? Because you're not contracting as fast. If they are hypercalcemic, it's going to be a lot shorter, right? There's other drugs that can affect the QT interval. Digitalis is one of them. Some of your antiarrhythmics can even affect it as well. All right, so our specific cardiac dysrhythmias. So when we're looking quickly to identify the dysrhythmia, we said we're looking in lead 2. But the thing about lead 2, as we're going to learn whenever we get into 12 lead, is the fact that lead 2 doesn't give us a complete view of the heart. And even in our 12 lead, we don't get a complete view of the heart. But it gives us a little bit of an idea of some other places as well. So again, if you have something that you think is cardiac in nature and you start seeing some type of arrhythmia, we always want to do a 12 lead, okay? Cardiac dysrhythmias are going to be induced by something that's affecting the electrical conduction system, right? Remember, the cardiac tissue is very sensitive to hypoxia or to stimulants. And not necessarily the stimulant itself, but what the stimulant does to the sympathetic nervous system, right? Because it just makes it work harder and harder and harder. And so a lot of times the dysrhythmias, they can be traced to ischemia if it is something that's tried and true. So remember our pink box of death on our algorithm. One of the things is, are they experiencing ischemic chest discomfort, right? So if we suspect that they're having ischemic chest discomfort, then we definitely want to get a 12 lead. Okay? So there's a couple other things. You got your disturbances of automaticity or conduction. One of those disturbances of conduction is the reentry mechanism. Tachydysrhythmias, bradydysrhythmias, life-threatening or non-life-threatening, or they can also be classified by the site from which they arise. The thing about it is that these arrhythmias can all be classified in multiple categories. So that's why I like to just teach it as the site. We start at the SA node and we move down. Remember the term here, ectopic foci. What does that mean? Ectopic foci.
Happening somewhere else than when it's supposed to.
Exactly. So, because a lot of times it's because of enhanced automaticity. So, that cardiac cell is going to meet its threshold quicker. It's going to react quicker. It's enhanced. And so, what happens is that electrical cell may not be necessarily part of the pacing here, but it's going to create its own conduction. Because remember the 4 properties of cardiac cells? Automaticity, contractility, excitability, and conductivity, right? So automaticity means that it can create an abnormal beat. Any of the cells that are electrical in nature in the heart can create a conduction. That's why a lot of times we try to give something that is a depolarizing agent, or we try to give something that depolarizes, like cardiac defibrillation, because all of the electrical output's going haywire, and we want everything to depolarize at one time. So hopefully, those ectopic foci will not get a signal to start creating their own conduction again, and the SA node, AV node, and all of that will pace. Remember the reentry mechanism there. The reentry mechanism. One example of reentry is AV nodal reentry tachycardia. And basically, you've got an ectopic foci that decides to discharge, and it is firing outside of the normal conduction pathway. So when it fires, the other electricity's not in that circuit there to where it will dissipate, and so it ends up making a complete circuit The conduction makes a complete circuit, and then it goes out all the tissue that's connected to that circuit. And the conduction from the SA node won't override that one conduction. So if you think of something like an AV nodal reentry tachycardia or a SVT is a type of SVT. When you think of like something like that, think about the fact that it's not multiple ectopic foci. It's one conduction that's creating each one of those. So it's like the electricity fired and nothing else is firing again. It's just that one conduction is continually going through. Now, is the SA node functioning? Yes, it is, but it's not able to override that reentry mechanism. So what do you need to do for something like AV nodal reentry tachycardia? What do you need to give them?
Adenosine.
Adenosine. Adenosine slows conduction at the AV node. So when it's going, it'll slow that conduction and it'll allow that other conduction from the SA node to come through, and it'll cause it to dissipate. That's the goal, or that's the idea there. We're going to start with our sinus rhythms. So your normal sinus rhythm, we've got our five rules that we're going to follow. And just remind me, what are they?
Rate, rhythm.
Rate, rhythm.
P wave.
P wave.
P wave. PRI and what?
QRS.
QRS. Alright. So normal sinus rhythm, how would you describe its rate?
67.
How would you describe its rhythm? How would you describe the P wave? Positive, rounded, etc. How would you describe its PRI?
0.12 to 0.20.
0.12 to 0.20, and is the QRS? 0.12 or less. So, which rules does it break? None. It is normal sinus. This is really the only time that you can call a strip normal sinus because it doesn't break any of the rules. Even as we move forward, we go to sinus bradycardia. Now we're starting to get into a little bit of rebellion here, and the rule that's broken with sinus bradycardia, it breaks one rule, and that's what?
Rate.
The rate. And how would I describe a sinus bradycardia with the rate?
Less than 60.
Less than 60. But it's going to follow all the other characteristics of a normal sinus rhythm. But because the rate is less than 60, then we can't call it a normal sinus rhythm. Alright? So, I found a file with a bunch of old strips in them. Like the dates on some of them are late 80s, early 90s. The heart hasn't changed. But I put a lot of these strips in here just so that y'all could see something that's not just a computer generated. Because this right here, this is a beautiful sinus bradycardia. Like it's like this person read the textbook and made their heart follow what the textbook says, right? This is computer generated, and that's what you see a lot in your books and all of that. And so one of the things that I would recommend when you're doing clinicals, and I'm sure you probably are now doing that now that you've been looking at rhythms and stuff, is every rhythm that you can, look at it. Try to follow the rules or try to interpret the rules on it. You're in the ER, look at the rhythms. You're on the ambulance, look at the rhythms. Alright? So this one is just a sinus bradycardia because I got a rate of 1, 2, 3, 4. I've got a rate of 40, and I've got a P wave. It's not a big, beautiful P wave, but I've got a P wave nonetheless. Just right there. Right there, right there, right there, right there. Alright? Let's look at another example. This one right here, it's got a much better P wave, but it's got almost an equiphasic waveform. But my rate for this is 50, so it's below 60, right? And my QRS is about 0.10. So it's following all the rules, right? But it doesn't look exactly like our computer generated one right there, okay? I say that, I throw this in there just so that you know, like, as you're interpreting these rhythms, sometimes your gut's going to say, hey, that's just sinus bradycardia, but you're going to be like, well, it doesn't look exactly like the picture I saw. That's okay. All right? So your sinus tachycardia is going to follow all the rules except for
Rate.
And what's my rate on sinus tachycardia?
Over 100 or over.
Over 100. What's my rate going to be? Y'all told me greater than 100. What's my rhythm going to be?
Regular.
What's my P wave going to look like?
Upright, round, similar.
Uniform, similar. What's my PR going to look like?
0.12, 0.20.
Yep, 0.12 to 0.20. What's my QRS going to be?
Less than 0.12.
Less than 0.12 or 120 milliseconds. All right? Here's another example. Now this one right here is going pretty fast, but that's your P wave right there. And so it follows all the rules. And how would I measure my PRI? Probably from about right there to my Q wave. I know that these are a little bit harder to see. So if you got a sinus tach, what is the initial consideration for any symptomatic patient in sinus tachycardia?
Treat the underlying symptom.
Exactly. What is causing the sinus tachycardia? Because in most cases, if it's a sinus tachycardia, you're going to find out that something underlying is causing the sinus tachycardia, and something underlying is causing the symptoms. So oftentimes, the sinus tachycardia is a symptom of the underlying disease process, right? Most cases, when somebody is symptomatic in sinus tachycardia, the sinus tachycardia is not what's causing the symptoms in them. What are some examples of things that can cause sinus tachycardia?
Working out.
Well, yeah, working out, sympathetic stimulation. All right, stimulants. Hypoxia, hypovolemia, shock response, right? Fever. One of the ways that I always know that my kids are running a fever is I can feel their heartbeat, like, without even trying to check the pulse. Like, they just start beating really fast because their body is metabolizing in overtime, and so that's causing the heart to go fast. Is it going to do me any good to try to treat my kid if they've got a tachycardia with any of my cardiac drugs or anything like that? No. What we need to do is try to bring that fever down to a little bit more manageable level, right? And then we'll see the heart rate go down. Same thing with something like hypovolemia. It's not going to do me any good to try to give them some adenosine or diltiazem or something like that if they're hypovolemic without giving them what first? Blood if they're hemorrhagic, or fluids. Exactly right. All right. So the next one, the sinus dysrhythmia. The rate for sinus dysrhythmia is usually what? 60 to 100. But the rhythm for sinus dysrhythmia? Irregular. It's going to follow the rules for everything else. So this is where you've got to measure and just use your calipers or use your piece of paper or whatever, but make sure that you're measuring there. Because my P wave is going to look good, everything else is going to look good, but it's just going to be irregular. All right, here's a couple of examples here. Now, typically, a sinus arrhythmia or sinus dysrhythmia is not very clinically significant. Why? Because if you look at this first one, the heart rate on it is still 60. This one, the heart rate is still about 50 or 60. But if you look at the computer-generated one, what's the heart rate there?
80.
About 80. Right? So that's what we're looking at is what's the rate, or really how many QRSs we've got, right? Because the QRSs is what creates the pulse. So sinus arrest, we've got the SA node is firing, and then suddenly it just stops. Arrest means what?
Cessation.
Cessation, sudden cessation. And then it picks back up again. So what is when we have an electrical standstill, how is that going to be represented? Yeah, as a period of asystole. Now, why don't you see anything ventricular in this aspect? What do the ventricles depend on in order to contract? The SA node. I know that the ventricles can start pacing on their own, but this short of time right here, they haven't really gotten the message, right? So that's why you're not going to see a ventricular conduction here. Now, you give it a few more and the ventricles don't get conducted, then they're going to say, hey, we need to start doing something. Okay? So, we're going to look at our rate. Should be within normal limits. Sometimes it's going to be less than 60. Like in this one here, it's 30. But we're going to look at the rhythm, and it's going to be irregular because our R to R's don't match up. Here's some other examples of sinus arrest. Now, this one right here, I would really need to see the patient. I guess the time between these two is pretty significant, but I would need to see the patient because this could just be a sinus dysrhythmia. And the same thing here, but this one's following more of a pattern. It's almost like a trigeminy pattern here, where every third beat the SA node doesn't fire, and it creates a period of arrest. I've never seen one that does like a pattern like that.
Well, with the QRS, would that be considered a third degree though?
No, because you've got constant PRIs. And in all honesty, your P waves are not regular because you got a disruption in the peak to peak, and your R waves are not regular because you got a disruption in your R to R. Okay?
You said that's a dysrhythmia or arrest?
No, this is arrest.
Okay.
This is arrest because what you're looking at here is the SA node fired, the SA node fired, and then the SA node didn't fire. SA node fired, then the SA node didn't fire. SA node fired, then it didn't fire. And eventually this is going to start leading to more ectopy being shown. You're going to start probably seeing PVCs. You're going to start seeing this space out, this period right here space out farther, and then it could go into a lethal rhythm. All right?